All right, so the next form that we're going to take a look at, this is a compensation agreement. And I sent to you both the compensation agreements and the modifications to those agreements. We're not going to review the modifications because basically it's a repeat of the form. You're just changing what you've originally agreed to. So this compensation agreement is from a seller to a buyer's broker. I'm not sure when you would use this, except in the instance where you might be working with a FSBO. This might come into play. I can't imagine any other scenario, but it's available for you, so we're going to talk about it. So you're going to the parties to the contract are the buyer's broker and the seller. You're going to include the property address and then the seller's broker, whoever that is. You have the term of the agreement. This compensation agreement takes effect when a fully executed copy has been delivered to all parties to this agreement and will remain in effect for, if left blank, 30 days. Make sure that you really understand this next part here. I would highlight this entire section 3 term so you really understand it and your customer understands it. In no event shall the term extend past the termination date of the seller's broker's current listing on the property, including any extensions or effective protection periods. So this is a really specific time frame here. Except that upon full execution of the contract for a sales and purchase contract by a buyer of the property procured by the buyer's broker, in other words, a purchase agreement, the term will automatically extend through the date of the actual closing. This is the same wording that we have in our listing agreements, right? If you have a listing and it's set to expire, but you have a contract on it, we know that that listing agreement extends through that closing. So you don't have to do anything with that. Then we have the buyer broker compensation. If the buyer broker is the procuring cause of sale of the property during the term, the seller will compensate the buyer broker as stated below at closing of the property. And they've designed this section to have maximum flexibility is what they said. So you can either agree to a flat fee, a percentage of the gross purchase price of the property, and you could add any additional money on there as well. So perhaps you're going to charge a percentage plus a transaction fee. It has an other box if there's some other scenario, and then there's also other terms. So again, I'd be very careful as to what you handwrite in, make sure it's very specific, but you're only going to check one of the 3 boxes. So it's one of the 3, you'll see that's in parentheses there. At the bottom of the page, this is really, really important, especially because Stellar just came out with some new changes to their format. When you're inputting a listing, you know how we have attachments, like where you put seller disclosure, HOA, disclosure, whatever it is. They have different sections now. One is private and one is public. And there's another one, I think, that extends past closing. So no, you cannot put this anywhere in the MLS. People were asking, well, can we put it under private? No, no compensation agreements can be attached in the MLS ever at all. And so this is the very bottom of the form under where everybody initials. It says the parties acknowledge this form should not be used to share offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives via any field in the multiple listing service. So part of the reason why why Stellar is initiating the change earlier than the 17th is they want to give people time to get all of that information or content that might be in there out of there. Because if you're found to have any kind of cooperating compensation anywhere at all, realtor remarks, public remarks, attachments, anything, Stellar is going to shut down your entire brokerage. Every single person in that brokerage will lose their access to Stellar. I don't know what that looks like long-term or how that's going to be reactivated, but I certainly wouldn't want to be the person who made that mistake and the entire brokerage can't work now, right? So you want to be super careful with that. All right, so we're on the second page of this agreement. And at the very top, it says the seller acknowledges that compensation paid to the buyer's broker is for services the buyer broker provided to the buyer. These forms are a little bit redundant, but they want to make sure that basically the general public knows exactly what it is they're paying for. And then we have dispute resolution, and this basically says the same thing as the buyer broker agreement and our listing agreement, that you're going to go to mediation first. If you decide you want to arbitrate, you're going to initial in the appropriate boxes. If you do not, then you have not agreed to arbitrate, and then you're more than likely going to litigation. And again, this is a broker decision, so you'll ask your broker what they would like for you to do in this part. They have miscellaneous clauses. This agreement will be construed under Florida law. Electronic signatures will be accepted and binding. It goes on to say the broker's commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. In no event will the buyer's broker compensation exceed the amount of compensation in the written agreement with the buyer. So again, we see this same language. You cannot earn more than whatever the buyer broker or showing agreement agrees to unless you get some kind of modification in writing. And then we just have the section for the signatures. So that is the seller to buyer broker. The next one is the seller broker to buyer broker. Please write this down, what I have written in red. Please write this on this form or make some kind of note to yourself so we understand the difference here. A lot of questions on this one too, like, well, why can't we just use this and have it, my broker agrees with your broker? It does not work that way. This has to be property specific. This is not a unilateral or a blanket agreement between brokerages. So this one is a compensation agreement, seller broker to buyer broker. You have the parties, the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. You're going to put the property address. You have to put the property address in order for this to be valid. And then you have the buyer's name, which is optional. And then you have the term. This reads exactly the same way as the other agreement, however long the term is going to be. And again, it's not going to extend for any extension or any protection period, but if you are under contract, this will extend during that time period. The buyer's broker compensation reads the same again. You can choose whatever it's going to be. And again, this is for maximum flexibility. You're going to choose one, which is going to be, got a little ahead of myself, sorry about that. So that's going to be either the flat fee, the percentage, or the percentage plus something else, the other terms, the other specify whatever it might be. Again, the same exact thing here. The parties acknowledge that this form should not be used to share offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives via any field in the multiple listing service. Just keep in mind that Stellar was a part of this, agreement and what kind of fell under the umbrella of protection here. And that means that they have to adhere to whatever the agreement is that NAR made with the Department of Justice. And that's why they're so serious about this. All right, so number 6, you'll notice that it doesn't even say dispute resolution, it just says arbitration. By initialing the space provided, the seller's broker or authorized associate and the buyer's broker or authorized associate agree that any unresolved dispute between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker will be submitted for binding arbitration by a mutual agreeable arbitrator. Because everybody on this call is a member of the association, Florida Realtors, the National Association of Realtors, you've agreed to adhere to the Code of Ethics, and Article 17 of the Code of Ethics dictates that 2 brokers will arbitrate if there's some kind of monetary dispute. So that's why that one reads differently. And I cannot overstate this enough. I get calls quite often with people asking questions about what they should do in the event, they're in the middle of a dispute, basically. And my first question is always, what did your broker say? And a lot of times, well, I didn't tell them, I didn't want to bother them. Please remember that's what your broker is there for. If there's a problem within the brokerage, every deal belongs to the broker. They're ultimately responsible for all of these things. So make sure that you're putting them in the loop very, very early on if there's any kind of dispute. All right, so the miscellaneous clause goes on to say just exactly the same as the other one. Commissions are not set by law, they're fully negotiable, and the compensation cannot exceed what the separate written agreement with the buyer states. So are there any additional questions that anyone wants to throw in the chat? That's all I have for today. They did not release all of the forms they said they were going to, but hopefully we'll be getting them in the days to come. Just going to see what questions we might have. Given the concessions are in fact the same as compensation, I think you should spend more time on that. So if I have a listing has been live for 2 months under the old rules, do we have to go in and change the compensation information? That entire field is going to go away. So there's not even going to be an offer of compensation field. That's going to be deleted. You won't have it. If your seller is willing to offer some kind of concession when that comes in on the 23rd, then you can go ahead and enter that. But yeah, other than that, and again, they have other forms coming out that's going to deal with how you transition if you have a current listing, but they just haven't released them yet. So I can't offer anything more than that information. So basically the seller is still paying the buyer broker, but instead of it being on the MLS, it will be a separate agreement Not necessarily. Can the seller still pay the buyer's broker? Yes. But it's not necessarily going to happen that way. And I'm sure that'll be largely dependent on the market that we're in. Right now, we're in a strong buyer's market, so I'm sure a lot of sellers will be willing to do that. But I think if we were in a market like we saw, a year and a half ago, no, I don't think that sellers likely would be offering any kind of compensation. So I think it's going to be very market dependent. I think a lot of it is going to be dependent upon, what the sellers can afford to do, whatever their personal financial situation calls for. And I think that, a new norm will eventually shake out with all of this. I think that it's going to be a big learning curve in the beginning. But, you sent us 4 forms to review. We just did 2 forms. So I sent you the buyer broker agreement, which we went over. I sent you the seller's broker to buyer's broker. I sent you both the agreement and the modification. I'm not going over the modification because it's literally the same form. You're just changing whatever the terms are going to be. And then the buyer's broker seller one, and we went over that form. We're not going to review the modification because again, it's exactly the same thing. If the seller does not offer compensation, then I am sure the buyer's broker will not show those properties. That's not true. And honestly, that's exactly why the Department of Justice, created this entire lawsuit, because they want everyone to pay for their own representation. So again, dependent upon whatever the market is or how things work out. But I would not say that. I would not write that, and I would not say that because, then you're going to be in a violation because you can't filter properties of who's not paying compensation. That's the whole purpose of the buyer broker agreement. You will be getting paid. You're getting paid by your buyer. If it's an instance where it's a first-time home buyer, somebody who doesn't have a lot of funds, that's something that you're just going to have to work on. You're just going to have to work that out and, talk to agents if you have to beforehand. But if you have somebody who's like, yeah, I can pay you X%, we're going to try and get something from somebody else. But if we can't, this is what I'm going to have to pay you. And that's the bottom line on that one. Any other questions? I'm not saying it is a true statement, but it will be really where most people can't afford. Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's going to be instances where people can't afford to do so. And so then that's going to be definitely a strategy. How are you going to work that out? Right? You're going to work with the lender. You're going to work with whatever property owners may be offering something. But I think buyers are going to have to understand that they're going to have to come to the table with more than, the 3.5% they might have had to in the past. So you're welcome. All right. So again, my name is Kristen Beverly. I'm the professional development